The Book of 1 Kings, fully summarized. The book begins with crusty old King David on his deathbed, and his servants had a lovely virgin named Abishag brought to him, but he did not have sex with her. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith and David, exalted himself as king, and he was super handsome, but David already swore that his son Solomon would be king. So Bathsheba was alerted by Nathan the prophet that some schmo, who was not her son, was on the throne, and so she went to David to alert him to the fact that Adonijah was on the throne. Nathan the prophet came as well to remind him of the promise he made to Bathsheba, and complain about how he and some others were not invited by Adonijah to sacrifice to God. So David confirmed that Solomon would be sitting on the throne, and he commanded Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah to take his son Solomon to Gihon, where he was to be anointed as king over Israel and Judah. So they did what he asked, and got Solomon on his father's mule straight to Gihon, and Solomon was announced as king there with great noise and music so loud it shook the earth. Then, while at a party, Jonathan, the son of Abiathar the priest, came to Adonijah and slapped him down, telling him that he wasn't king anymore, and King Solomon was his rightful ruler. Adonijah's guests all abandoned him, and so he went and prayed on the horns of the altar for King Solomon not to kill him. Solomon did end up sparing him out of mercy when he pledged his loyalty. As David was about to die, he gave his son Solomon instructions to be strong and faithful to God, and to walk in his way and follow his commands, so that he would prosper by God's hand. Then David told Solomon to carry out justice on specific individuals who had done him wrong. He told Solomon to kill Joab, who unrighteously killed Commander Amasa and Abner of Israel in the previous book, and Shimei, who had cursed David in the previous book. I guess that talk about forgiving him was just virtue signaling, since David never let his grudge go and passed on his vengeance to his son. Those two were to be killed by Solomon, but the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite were to be shown kindness because they helped David when he fled from Absalom. David then died and was buried, and Solomon's kingdom was fully established. As consolation for having his kingship stolen away from him, Adonijah asked Bathsheba to request Solomon to give him Abishag the virgin, who tended to David, to him as his wife. Bathsheba went to her son Solomon with Adonijah's request, but Solomon got super offended and pronounced that Adonijah was to be put to death, and so Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was sent by Solomon and killed Adonijah. After this act of kinslaying, Solomon pronounced that Abiathar the priest was also deserving of death, but he spared him because he had carried the ark of the Lord, and so he simply removed him from the priesthood. Then Joab, fearing for his life in the face of this young tyrant, fled to the tabernacle of the Lord, and Solomon told Benaiah to go kill him for the innocent blood he had spilled. So Joab was killed and taken to be buried in his own house, with Solomon proclaiming his sin would be upon his head forever, and the heads of his descendants. Solomon then set Benaiah over the army and instituted Zadok as priest in the place of Abiathar. Then Solomon told Shimei to dwell in Jerusalem, and if he ever left, he would kill him, and Shimei agreed. However, after his slaves ran away to Gath and were all like, "What are you going to do about it, huh? Come at me, bro," Shimei apparently forgot Solomon's command and went after them to bring them back. So Solomon had Benaiah go out and kill him for his crime. Moral of the story? Keep your slaves on a tight leash, or else you just might be murdered. In the next chapter, Solomon made an alliance with Egypt and married the daughter of the Pharaoh. He then started working on his house and the house of God and the wall of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, his followers were sacrificing in high places. Solomon also fell victim to the allure of the high places, with the house of the Lord not yet finished construction, but he was mostly faithful to the Lord, and he offered him 1,000 animal sacrifices at Gibeon. Thus the Lord appeared to him in a dream and told him that anything he wanted he would give him. Solomon praised God, but acknowledged he was basically discount Joffrey and had no idea what he was doing, so he asked for discerning wisdom and judgment, which pleased God, and he was granted his wish. God also gave him great riches, and told him he was to be king over his people like no other, the wisest man to ever live. God then promised that if Solomon followed him, then his days would be long, and so Solomon awoke, came back to Jerusalem, and offered up more offerings to God at the ark. But it was time for a real test of Solomon's wisdom. 2 harlot women came before him, and one of the women was claiming that her child was stolen by the other woman, whose baby had died in the night. But the other woman denied it and said that the baby she had was her own. So after hearing the 2 bicker, Solomon said that he was going to chop the baby in half and give a portion to each woman.
Genius!
The true mother of the child cried out in horror, while the faker woman was totally fine with the decision. Like, why though? What was she going to do with half a baby anyway? So Solomon immediately knew who the true mother was and gave her the child, and the children of Israel all feared his brilliant, impeccable wisdom. Then the Bible lists all of Solomon's officials and governors and what regions and sections they ruled over. Israel and Judah were greatly prospering, the people were making babies like nobody's business, and Solomon's name was known far and wide, and he demanded much tribute from his subjects. The land was safe, and there was no lack of any resources whatsoever. Solomon was the wisest man on earth and produced 3,000 entire proverbs and 1,005 songs. Men over all of the earth came to experience his wisdom, and he soon prepared to build a great temple of worship for the Lord. And unlike David, he had the ability to, because he was not constantly having to fight a bunch of wars. Hiram, king of Tyre, was a lover of David. Ooh, I bet he was. So he sent his servants to Solomon to ask him if anything he needed. Solomon demanded that Hiram cut down cedar trees from Lebanon for him to use, and Hiram agreed to help Solomon and praised the Lord. Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat and 20 cores of pressed oil in return for his services, and the 2 men made a treaty together. Then Solomon raised a labor force of 30,000 men of Israel to bring back the trees to Israel. He then organized 70,000 men who carried burdens, 80,000 men who quarried stone, and 3,300 men who supervised the laborers for the construction of the Lord's temple. The next chapter then lists all of the measurements for the temple of the Lord and how it was constructed. God promised Solomon to not forsake him if he continued to walk in his ways and serve him. And so Solomon completed the temple and the wall surrounding it after 7 years. The rest of the chapter again goes on to list each and every detail of how it was constructed and what materials were used. He ended up overlaying the entire temple with gold, as well as the altar, and inside the inner sanctuary he made some decorations, including cherubim overlaid with gold, and palm trees and flowers that were also coated with gold, as was the floor. Yeah, like I said, basically everything was just paved with gold, because when I think of the world's wisest man, I think of someone so eager to show off his wealth that he paints everything with gold. Then Solomon constructed his own massive house over the course of 13 years, which, as a testament to his massive ego, was over 4 times as large as the Lord's house. The house was in the forest of Lebanon, and the chapter describes it in great detail with all its measurements, with the hall of pillars and the hall of judgment where he might judge, and he made a house for his wife as well, all of these being made out of incredibly expensive stones. Solomon then brought in King Hiram of Tyre to do all his bronze work, and he made some structures out of bronze which the chapter lists in great detail, including 2 pillars with 2 chapiters, and 400 pomegranates being used for decoration, a molten sea of bronze, and 12 oxen to hold up the sea. In addition to a lot of other stuff, 4 wheeled carts and lavers were also made of bronze, which the book lists and describes in great detail, as well as the decorations and accessories. Then finally, the book lists all of the decorations of the temple of the Lord that were made, and yeah, there was a lot of gold and bronze. In the next chapter, Solomon assembled all of the elders of the Lord and the heads of the tribes to Jerusalem to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And all the people came on the 7th month, and countless animal sacrifices were given to God, as the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant into its rightful place, into the inner sanctuary of the Lord under the wings of the cherubim. The only thing in the ark was the 2 tablets of stone that God gave to Moses, and the house of the Lord was filled with the dark cloud of God, because God liked to dwell in his evil lair alone. Solomon then blessed the assembly of Israel and gave a speech about how he would carry on the work of his father David, and how he had fulfilled his father's promise to build a house for the Lord to dwell in. Then Solomon prayed to the Lord for about a page and a half, saying, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in existence, and you will keep your covenant with us, because we are your servants. So remember me, Lord, for I am the son of your servant David. This temple that I have made is not nearly sufficient to contain you, but at least be pleased with the supplication of your people a little bit. I ask you to condemn and punish the wicked, and show mercy to the faithful and repentant, and hear your people's cries when they cry out to you. When you afflict them because of their sins, please forgive them, and teach them the good way to walk, and remove your hand from them. Only you know the hearts of all men, so give to each what is due, and make them fear you, your people and the foreigners, and when your people go into battle, fight for their cause. Always forgive your people who have transgressed against you, and have compassion on them, when they cry out to you in repentance, for they are your inheritance, that you separated them from the other peoples of the earth. Solomon then blessed the assembly of Israel again, and told them that the Lord would be with them, and that he had not gone back on any of his promises, and he hoped that the people would not go back on their promises to God, and that they would still be loyal to him. Solomon then offered up 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep to God. Damn, that's a lot of animal sacrifices. What a waste. He also threw a great feast for all of Israel that lasted 14 days. In the next chapter, God appeared to Solomon a second time, and he told him that he had heard Solomon's prayer and supplication to him, and he would be looking over Israel forever, staying in his swanky cedar house. God promised that he would maintain Solomon's kingdom for all time if he remained faithful, but warned him that if he or the Israelites did not remain faithful, then he would not keep his promise to establish Solomon's great kingship, and he would cast Israel out of the land he had given them and bring total calamity on them. King Solomon then gave King Hiram of Tyre 20 cities in the land of Galilee in exchange for his services, but Hiram didn't like them that much. Hiram still gave Solomon 120 talents of gold, though. Kind of worthless, if you ask me, since he literally had everything covered in gold. The chapter then lists all of the structures and cities Solomon had constructed with his slaves, all non-Israelites, of course, who were remnants of the cultures not completely destroyed in the Promised Land genocides. Wars. Solomon had 550 officers to organize the slave labor. So the wisest man to ever live was totally cool with using slave labor. Interesting. The chapter then states that Solomon came up 3 times a year to sacrifice on the altar of the Lord, and Solomon also built a bunch of ships to use to trade and obtain great wealth from other nations. The Queen of Sheba heard of the fame and wisdom of Solomon, and came to him to test him with hard questions that are never stated in the book, because, as the baby halving incident before showed, the writer clearly isn't smart enough to write smart characters. Solomon, of course, answered all her questions correctly, and she saw that he was wise, and also saw the ridiculously excessive wealth that Solomon had obtained, and was speechless. She gave him a bunch of ego-boosting compliments, as well as a bunch of valuable gifts, including about 9,000 pounds of gold, because he was just in so much need of more wealth. And then Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba anything she desired after that. Solomon was given many riches from other peoples of the land who were impressed by him, gaining a quite satanic 666 talents of gold in 1 year, and he had many imported treasures and animals obtained by his fleet. Gold and silver practically had become worthless by that point. Man, must have devastated their economy. And so the king made a bunch more decorations and structures and lined them all with pure gold. And Solomon's kingdom had officially surpassed all others on the earth. Solomon did not heed the words of the Lord, though, and took 700 wives and 300 concubines from foreign lands, who converted him to worshipping their gods. So the wisest man to ever live was convinced that he should follow other gods besides Yahweh. Interesting. He no longer sacrificed to God, so Solomon was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he built a bunch of abominable high places to worship these other gods. God was angry with him and promised to tear his kingdom away from him after he was dead, and his descendants would not possess the throne. Solomon himself would still have to deal with various adversaries to oppose him, like Hadad the Edomite, who fled from his home to Egypt when David's commander Joab went in and slaughtered every single male in the land. When he realized David was dead, he wanted revenge, as did Rezon, the son of Eliadah, who fled from his homeland of Zobah too, when Israel came to slaughter his people. Then Solomon's servant Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king because he had been told by the prophet Abijah that he would rule over the tribes of Israel, except for Judah, because God no longer favored Solomon because of his wickedness, but he still vowed to carry on David's line as the ruler of Jerusalem. God promised that he would give the tribes to Jeroboam as long as he heeded God's commands, and his line would endure. Solomon got angry and tried to kill Jeroboam, so he fled to Egypt until Solomon died. And then the rest of Solomon's life is completely skipped over because are not his acts listed in the book of the Acts of Solomon? So his son Rehoboam was now on the throne and was crowned in Shechem, and the people requested he lighten their load since his father Solomon had made it heavy. However, Rehoboam was not lenient with his people, and he ignored the elders' advice to heed them, and instead vowed to work them to the bone and chastise them with scorpions, according to the advice of his younger friends that they had given him. He announced his tyranny to all the people of Israel, so they rebelled against him as God intended, and he fled to Jerusalem in the tribe of Judah. The Israelites would never again be loyal to the house of David, but Rehoboam assembled the house of Judah to him and planned to fight back against Israel, which had dethroned him, and placed Jeroboam in his place. But the Lord told the man of God Shemaiah to tell Rehoboam that he was not to go up to fight against his brethren. So after he was told, Rehoboam obeyed. Incidentally, Jeroboam feared now that Jerusalem, the capital city of sacrifice, was not in his hands, and that his control would slip away if all of Israel still went to Jerusalem to sacrifice to God. So he had people worship 2 golden calves that he made them believe brought them out of Egypt, because he wanted them to be loyal to him and him alone. He also constructed high places, made priests from non-Levites, and sacrificed to the false calf gods he had made. In the next chapter, a man of God, who is never named, went from Judah to see Jeroboam in Bethel, and he told him that his precious altar would be split apart. Jeroboam tried to arrest the man of God, but his hand shriveled immediately when he tried to touch him, and the altar was split apart, so he begged for mercy. So the man of God asked the Lord to restore his hand, which he did, and then the man of God left Bethel as quickly as he came, as per God's instructions. While on his journey back to Judah, the man of God was confronted by an old prophet, also unnamed, living in Bethel, who asked him to eat with him. But the man of God said he could not, because the Lord had commanded him not to go into any stranger's house. The prophet tricked him into going into his house and eating with him, though, by saying that an angel of the Lord had appeared to him and told him to bring him in. And so the man of God went with him to his house. But the Lord was upset that the man of God had broken his promise to him, and he sent a lion after him when the man of God left the house of the prophet, which devoured him. His carcass was buried by the prophet, who regretted his lie that led to a man's death. Say, why wasn't the prophet punished for lying, instead of the man of God, who fell for the lie? Exactly. Anyway, the prophet made his sons promise to bury him in the same tomb as the man of God when he died. With the man of God gone, Jeroboam continued in his idolatry. Seems like God might have benefited from not sending a lion to go and kill him. But Jeroboam's son Abijah soon became sick. Jeroboam told his wife to go to the prophet Ahijah for wisdom, but Ahijah told her that the child would surely die, because pro-death Yahweh had decided it for the sins of Jeroboam that he had carried out. Ahijah proclaimed to her that God had said, Jeroboam had done evil in my sight, more than any who ever came before him, and worshipped molded images to enrage me. And therefore I will bring disaster upon his house, and kill all the males of his house that piss against the wall, and feed them to the dogs and the birds. So yeah, Abijah was definitely going to die. The Lord also said that he would send another king of Israel to usurp Jeroboam, and he would strike and scatter Israel for its sins. So the wife of Jeroboam returned to Tirzah, and her child died and was buried. Then the rest of Jeroboam's rule is completely skipped over because is it not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Rehoboam's rule in Judah was also pretty lousy as the people were being defiant against God, and they built a bunch of high places where they worshipped graven images. And there were also a bunch of homos in the land. Shishak, king of Egypt, also came up and stole all the riches of the land procured by Solomon. Then it completely skips over the rest of Rehoboam's reign because is it not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Rehoboam's son, Abijam, then became king in Judah and was unfaithful to God and walked in all the sins of his father. But nevertheless, God maintained his rule as a solid to David, who never did anything that displeased him, except for the whole Bathsheba incident. Then the book completely skips over the rest of Abijam's reign, because is it not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Then Abijam's son Asa reigned in Judah, and was faithful to God, and expelled the homos and false idols from the land, even slapping down his mother from her queenship for her possession of a false idol. The high places were still not removed, but other than that, Asa was pretty much the perfect king, and he brought into the land all of the things of gold and silver. Also, a war carried on between Israel and Judah all his days, and he made a treaty with the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, to be allied with Judah rather than Israel by bribing him with treasure. So Ben-Hadad set his armies against Israel with Asa. Asa eventually died and was replaced by his son Jehoshaphat, and the book completely skips over the rest of Asa's reign, because is it not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Then the book steps back a bit and tells of Nadan as the king reigning in Israel after Jeroboam, but he was not faithful to the Lord and was killed at Giberon by Baasha, son of Ahijah, who became king himself. He also killed the entire house of Jeroboam according to the Lord's instructions. Then Baasha reigned in Israel, but he was not faithful and did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so God proclaimed that he had done evil to provoke him to anger, and he promised to feed the corpses of all his ancestors to the dogs and the birds. Baasha died, and the rest of his kingship is completely skipped over by the book, because is it not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? After Baasha died, there were a bunch more kings of Israel, including his son Elah, whose servant and captain of chariots, Zimri, conspired against him and killed him. Then Zimri became king and utterly wiped out the house of Baasha, killing everyone that pissed on the wall, at the command of the Lord. But his reign didn't last long, because the men of Israel had Omri, the commander of the army, made king over Israel. Then when all of Israel went with Omri to fight against Zimri, Zimri burned the king's house down on top of himself, committing suicide, which he deserved because he had committed treason and did evil in the sight of the Lord. Then the people of Israel were divided between wanting to follow Tibni, the son of Ginath, and wanted to follow Omri. But Omri prevailed, and Tibni died. So Omri officially became king and built a city called Samaria on a hill. And he did even more evil in the sight of the Lord than any before him by worshipping false idols. The rest of his kingship is completely skipped over by the book, because is it not written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? His son Ahab reigned in Israel in the city of Samaria, but he did even more evil in the sight of the Lord than any before him, and served Baal and sacrificed to him, making wooden images. But the city of Jericho did manage to get built during his reign by Hiel the Bethelite, who sacrificed his oldest and youngest son's bodies as construction material at the Lord's command, so good on him, I guess. In the next chapter, Elijah the Tishbite of Gilead was told by the Lord that he would not allow any rain to come down for a few years, because I guess he realized that he hadn't tried out death by thirst yet. At God's command, Elijah went to the brook Cherith, where the ravens would give him food. Wait, what? And so the Lord's prophecy of drought came to pass. The Lord then told him to go to the home of a widow in Zarephath. So he went and called out to the widow for water. The woman was kind to him, but also running low on food, because, the horrible drought the Lord caused. But Elijah told her she would have infinite flour and oil to sustain herself and her son. And he was right, as the flour and oil was never used up, and Elijah ate with her for many days. However, the son of the widow became sick and died, and the widow got angry at Elijah for bringing misfortune upon her. But he called upon the power of God to revive the child, and he came back to life. Elijah did it first, Jesus, you're not special. Then, after he stayed with her a while longer, the word of God came to Elijah, and he told him to present himself to King Ahab of Israel. If he did, the water would come back after 3 years of drought. The wicked King Ahab, as well as Governor Obadiah, a good man who had shielded 100 prophets of the Lord from the wrath of Ahab's wife Jezebel, both split up to find some grass in the land to keep the animals alive. As Obadiah was searching, he came across Elijah, who asked Obadiah to take him to Ahab. Obadiah told Elijah of the good deeds he had done in service of the Lord, but he explains that he cannot come back to Ahab and tell him of Elijah, because Elijah would just disappear again, and Ahab would kill him out of anger. Elijah promised that he would not disappear, and so when Ahab was brought to meet Elijah, they squared off, and Elijah challenged Ahab to a God contest, where Elijah would prove that Yahweh was mighty on Mount Carmel, and where the prophets of Baal would also try to prove that their Baal was superior in front of all the congregation. So Ahab sent for all 450 prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel. Elijah had 2 bulls prepared, and said that both he and the prophets of Baal would call upon the name of their God, and whichever bull caught on fire would belong to the ones worshipping the one true God. Funny how we never have anything like this test in the modern day. Seems like it would be a pretty convincing way to get people to believe in the one true God. So from morning to evening, the prophets of Baal tried to call upon the name of Baal to burn the bull, but to no avail, even cutting themselves to honor him. And so Elijah mocked them, saying, "What, is your God just sleeping or on vacation?" When it was certain that Baal would do nothing, Elijah set up his bull sacrifice and doused it with 4 barrels of water, which doesn't seem very practical since it literally had not rained in years, but anyway, then God set fire to his sacrifice on demand, and the people fell on their faces in awe. The Israelites had faith in Yahweh again, and all 450 prophets of Baal were executed, and the droughts ended. Then, while it was raining, Ahab rode away to Jezreel, but God gave Elijah super speed, so he ran ahead of Ahab, arriving first. But Elijah had to flee from Israel because Ahab's wife Jezebel sought revenge for him executing the prophets. And after a single day's journey, Elijah broke down crying like a wuss and wished for death. But an angel of the Lord gave him a bunch of food, and he gained enough strength to sustain himself for 40 days somehow, enough to get to the mountain of God in Horeb. He spent the night in a cave while the Lord appeared to him, and he told God how Israel was seeking his life. But the Lord told him to go to Damascus and appoint Hazael as king over Syria. Then God told him to appoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king of Israel. Elisha, son of Shaphat, was to be his replacement prophet. And one other tiny detail, everyone in Israel was to be killed by those 3 men except for the 7,000 who had not worshipped Baal. Then Elijah met up with Elisha, who followed him and became his protege. In the next chapter, Ben-Hadad, king of the Syrians, gathered his forces together with his many allies and threatened Israel with destruction if King Ahab did not relinquish all his possessions and finest children and women. Ahab initially didn't deny his request to the messengers of Ben-Hadad, but the elders and the people of Israel told him not to consent to the deal. And so he refused the request of the Syrians and even got into some trash talking about King Ben-Hadad. When Ben-Hadad was notified of this by the messengers he sent to Israel who had returned, he got ready to attack the city of Samaria. But a prophet of the Lord came to Ahab and told him that the Lord would deliver Israel to victory. So Ahab gathered his troops, only 700 in all, and they went out to fight. Ben-Hadad was pretty drunk and overconfident, but the Syrians were utterly slaughtered, and they tried to escape, mocking Yahweh and calling him God of the Hills. Ben-Hadad tried to gather his armies and set out to fight back against Israel, planning to meet them in the fields where they thought they would have a greater advantage. For 7 days, both sides lied in wait for the other to make a move, and then finally they fought, and the Israelites killed 100,000 foot soldiers of the Syrians in a single day. The rest fled to the city of Aphek, but then a wall fell and somehow managed to crush 27,000 of them. Must have been a really big wall. Then Israel made a treaty with the surviving king Ben-Hadad for peace, after the Syrians groveled on their knees and promised to restore the cities Ben-Hadad had taken from the Israelites. Then God sent a lion to kill someone for the crime of refusing to injure his masochistic neighbor.
Children, animals, old people, doesn't matter. I just love killing.
The neighbor did eventually get another guy to injure him, though. This masochist was actually a son of a prophet and traveled to condemn King Ahab for not killing Ben-Hadad and proclaimed that the all-merciful God would kill him for this act of mercy.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
Ahab returned to Samaria in distress and tried to convince Naboth of Jezreel to give him his vineyard. But Naboth said that the Lord had forbidden him to give up his inheritance. Ahab went to his room crying because he couldn't get his hands on that vineyard, but his wife Jezebel encouraged her husband to have some goddamn respect, for crying out loud. So Jezebel arranged for Naboth to be stoned to death by framing him for blasphemy, which was of course punishable by stoning in this theocratic hellhole. When Jezebel gave him the news, Ahab went to possess his vineyard for farming, but the Lord was displeased with this, and he told Elijah to go and tell Ahab that he was going to get his blood licked by dogs. Elijah then went and told Ahab that he had done great evil in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord would have Ahab and his wife and everyone of his house who pissed on the wall fed to dogs and birds. It was true that Ahab had behaved extremely wickedly, but Ahab gave penance in the form of fasting, so God promised only to do what he promised to the males of his house after he died instead, because children are responsible for the sins of their father. In the last chapter, Ahab realized that there was peace in the land, so he got the idea of starting a war with Syria again. He tried to get the help of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, and he agreed, but told Ahab to see if God was cool with it first. So Ahab asked his prophets whether he should attack Ramoth-Gilead to take it from Syria, and they all said yes, but Jehoshaphat wanted to be really thorough, so he had Ahab call the prophet Micaiah, son of Imlah, to ask him what he thought. Micaiah was brought to the two kings, and he originally lied and said that Israel would have victory, but he was compelled by Jehoshaphat to tell the truth, and so he said that Israel would be scattered over the mountains if they went to war. King Ahab of Israel didn't like the prophecy, but Micaiah was adamant that he knew the Lord was secretly leading his army to total devastation, and that he had sent a lying spirit to deceive all of the prophets in their predictions, because God is the author of confusion. Ahab did not believe Micaiah, however, and he had him thrown in prison. Then Ahab and Jehoshaphat went up to battle, and Ahab disguised himself so as not to be targeted. But that didn't do him a fat lot of good, as he got shot by a stray bow, and bled to death on the battlefield. So Israel retreated, and Ahab's body was brought to Samaria and was buried. And God's promise of dogs licking Ahab's blood came true as they licked his blood off his chariot. Jehoshaphat survived the battle and returned to rule Judah righteously. And then Ahaziah, Ahab's son, ruled in his place and did more evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baal. Again with Baal? What is so alluring to the Israelites about this deity? Like, does he let people masturbate without making them feel guilty or something? Then the book talks about Jehoshaphat and his rule of Judah and how he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and banished the homos and made ships, yet he didn't take away any of the high places. And he also made peace with Israel as king of Judah, and when he was dead, his son Jehoram ruled. The end. So, I guess we're just gonna ignore that part a few verses ago where God said everyone of Israel was to be wiped out except for 7,000 people who didn't worship Baal. Just, sweep it under the rug there. Yeah, that's cool. It never happened.